Hello and welcome to Car Dealer Live. Today we are talking about electric vehicle adoption here in the UK, what's the demand like, and the latest in the world of electric cars. And if you've got time, we'll have a little chat about the new and used car market. Joining me to chat more about this is, of course, Auto Trader's Ian Plummer. Hello, Ian.
Hi there, James. Nice to see you.
Lovely to have you on in. Always good to have a chat about the new and used car market, especially electric cars, something which everyone is talking about at the moment. Now, I've been reading Auto Trader's Road to 2030 report recently. And for dealers watching this, it's a report which looks at the progress that the government and the industry is making towards the mass take-up of EVs. Really interesting reading. I do urge everybody to go and read it. Now, this is a point that you and I have spoken a lot about over the last 2 years, obviously, increasingly so. But from your perspective, let's just look back in time a little bit. How has demand been for electric vehicles over the past couple of years?
Firstly, I think the news is very positive, James. I think there's been a lot of progress. Demand has been fueled by three things, essentially, that we can see in the numbers. More choice, considerably more choice of vehicles. We've seen a fourfold increase of cars, electric cars, or plug-ins at least, including some plug-in hybrids coming into the UK in the last year. Roughly, we've been seeing a new plug-in being launched every week in the last few weeks, so it's quite impressive. That fuels interest, and that's added to by the fact that awareness is growing. That's grown 3 times up on 2020 numbers. That's fueled, no doubt, by not just the plethora of great-looking electric cars that are coming through, and there really are some amazingly attractive models, and not the sort of geeky, slightly gadgety cars that we remember of EVs sort of a few years back, far, far from it, but also driven by the brand spend on media for these cars as they're coming to market. We're seeing probably £2 in every 3 being spent by OEMs on their plugins just now, and that's only growing at a fast rate of knots. And that's flowing into the third point, which obviously is the direct result of demand, which is actual sales. We finished last year at 11.6% of the new car market as EV plug-in battery electric vehicles. Add in plug-ins, and it's considerably more. They're ahead of diesel, for example. They're now rising ahead of all fuel types in terms of interest. And I think what's really quite exciting is that in the last couple of months of 2021, first couple of months of this year, we're probably on track for a high teens, maybe even 20% market share. So 2 in 10 of new cars being sold as EV, as I said, is a very positive start point.
Yeah. Now, I do think the marketing spend point you made there is very interesting, because I can't remember the last time I saw an advert on TV for an ICE engine car. I mean, I think if a manufacturer did do an advert about an ICE engine car, they'd probably stand out, wouldn't they? Really. But I would imagine, though, that, I mean, over the past few weeks, especially over the last week or so, things have changed again, haven't they? Of course, we've got the tragic circumstances in Ukraine. We've got rising energy bills, interest rates going up. I mean, EVs are taking on a new interest for a lot of people, really, aren't they?
They are indeed. And James, we like a bit of data at Auto Trader, so I'm going to share a chart with you, if I may, and hopefully you can see that on your screen right now.
Yeah, we can.
Lots of squiggly lines, but these squiggly lines, although they may look complicated, tell a very clear story. Firstly, they tell a story of rising interest in electric vehicles. More latterly, on the right-hand side, you can see we're up to date with today's data. This winds back on the left-hand side of your screen to the beginning of 2019. There are 3 different colors. The gray line is plotting the share of stock of new electric vehicles on our platform. It used to be, obviously, you can see a minute proportion of our stock. That generated a share of ad views, one of our key currency points of level of expression of interest, if you like, in electric vehicles, which is the red line, which was equally very low back in 2019, growing substantially through the last couple of years, and blue, which is the share of leads. You can see there are a couple of spikes in the middle of the chart that reflect the growth of the spurt of interest, usually not very sustained. When we saw announcements around the cutoff of ICE ban from 2035 in the first case to 2030 in the second, people jumped on Auto Trader and had a look at those electric cars. What we saw in autumn last year was a much greater level of sort of spike of interest. with roughly 1 in 4 of new cars being looked at on the platform as electric. That waned only belatedly in January. It dropped down to around 15%, and now it's jumped back again. If you look to the far right-hand side of the chart, as the petrol price sort of hits the 165, 170 pounds a litre barrier, that is definitely, again, just like the fuel crisis of last autumn, spurring people into the desire to find an alternative, and electric or plug-in electric, if not, is definitely looking like a suitable solution for many, many people.
I mean, I think the important thing to note here, and it's a difficult thing to actually to correlate, though, this is just interest, isn't it? It's not necessarily people walking into the showroom saying, right, I'm going to change out of my petrol car into an electric car because I've just filled my car up down the road and I've just spent £1.70 to fill it. But the point still remains, though, is interest levels, and interest levels have changed dramatically over, let's face it, a relatively short period of time, haven't they?
Well, quite. Referring to my point a minute ago around the fact we hit 11.6% of sales last year, that is literally double what it was the year before. And you can see that the kind of interest levels we're getting on Auto Trader, people looking at cars, expressing an interest via a lead, that nearly always is becoming a sale. If you look at the same chart as this one, and I don't have that one to share with you today, on used cars, you can see that the only problem we have is that in last autumn and right now, as the interest spikes, we could plot the sales number as well, because you can see that the gray line would sharply drop as the interest spikes, because there are no additional used EVs to bring into the market. Luckily, in new EVs, we're able to hopefully, the supply issues out there, of course, hopefully replenish a sold vehicle with a new one. In the used context, clearly that's not possible. So there is a dearth of available used EVs to satisfy the much higher levels of demand that we're seeing. But I think it's equally very good to see that from the industry point of view, from a retailer as well as a brand point of view, to see that expression of interest, these blue and red lines, are ahead of even the sales numbers. Again, that does portray the sort of context of a seller's market that I think we've been talking about being in for a good period of several months now, and that's a healthy place for the industry to be.
So that's really interesting in there. So let's just talk a little bit about demographics, because this has been a point we've spoken a lot about over the past couple of years, haven't we? There's especially there's an assumption that everybody within the UK can afford to buy a new or a used electric car, but of course we need to get to a price parity, or more of a level playing field, if we're going to reach these targets of 2030, aren't we?
Completely, James. And there is a lot of progress, as I've touched on, but I think what we're seeing is the people who can afford to buy an electric vehicle and afford the sort of green premium of those cars are the ones that are stepping into the market right now. And there's probably a gap that we're going to have to bridge of democratizing electric vehicles and really trying to reach the mass market by going much further than we've currently been able to do. What we're seeing in the demographics of people buying electric cars, as this chart shows, is that generally speaking, they are wealthier, older, and from the social grades of A and B and so on. Typically, on top of that, we could say that they're very likely to have off-street parking, quite often likely also to be buying an electric vehicle as a second car rather than relying on it as their sole car. So long as we're limiting things in this way to wealthier folks, I think we are going to be limiting ourselves to the amount of scope we can get for the EV rollout, and we'll probably run out of wealthier people, to be quite frank with you, who can afford an electric vehicle. So there's going to need to be some progress made in that direction. And I think what we try to do with our retailer partners and brands is try to use this kind of analysis where you can see the postcodes that are the darker reds of those who are more likely to be expressing interest in EVs, looking at EVs on Auto Trader, compared to those in the blue, the darker blue, equating to the sort of colder electric interest zones. And whether it be a town or a city in the north of England or the south of England or the west or the east, the story is the same. There is no north-south divide fundamentally, but there is a wealth divide. If you take the example here of the Manchester region, you can see the wealthier parts of South Manchester, of let's say Altrincham, show this high propensity to look at EVs and to buy them. Just a 10-minute journey down the road, a couple of miles down the road in Wythenshawe, the exact opposite is the case. We're in dark blue. You can see there that the average house price is double in Altrincham compared to Wythenshawe. and the household income levels are sort of 20 times greater. So you are talking about a significant wealth factor that is today driving interest in EVs. I think what we need to see is a greater level of choice as well. And this clever little squiggly chart will show you the growth of choice that we've seen. As I touched on earlier, it has grown massively over the last year or so. And we are seeing now a new plug-in being launched every week, a new battery electric every 10 days or so. So there is a far greater array of vehicles, small, medium, large, different price brackets and so on to look at. But still, to be frank, not enough variability in choice. So this chart tries to track the type of vehicle that we've got, and another chart in a second on the price brackets. You can see that EV models in the blue on the left, ICE in red on the right. There is an increasing level of choice of EVs. The bar for each of the categories for SUV at the top for 2022 shows 27 models instead of 16, but it's increasing. ICE slightly the other way around, but clearly you can see that there is 4 times the amount of choice in ICE than EV. So there's still a long way to go for us to assume that there's every make, model, sort of size, segment and so on covered for EVs to be able to really match choice for everybody. And choice also can be expressed in terms of an equation of affordability. So here we try to map equally a different way of looking at things in terms of affordability. So choice in budget ranges. So you've got the different price buckets, if you like, on the left-hand side. And you can see that the cheaper electric vehicles are very rare. In the sub 10,000 bracket, they're very limited. There's a Twizy, fantastic model. I enjoyed launching it when I was back at Renault Nissan a while ago, but I wouldn't want to drive one around in a wet, windy Manchester cold evening in January.
No.
And the Smart 4.2 or the 4.4 are equally great models for certain usage, but they're not quite as good as the equivalents clearly in the ICE ranges that we've got on the chart here. And you can see the headline shows that there are, on Auto Trader, 15% of the ICE cars that people are looking at are sub £20,000. There are 58 models to look at, but you've only got those 3 equivalent EV models in that sub 10,000 and sub 20,000 even. So a long way to go for us to really get to the point where choice is anything like the equivalent scale for electric vehicle to ICE. And this is one of the factors which we know will drive demand. It's a supply-led equation, in my opinion. Supply-led for product, supply-led equally for infrastructure, we know. So we do need the continuous efforts of brands to bring these products to market and the continuous efforts of charging providers to make sure that infrastructure is something that is seen as an opportunity. I can see an empty charging station when I'm thinking about buying an electric vehicle rather than one with a queue on it. The queue will put me off. The empty one will encourage me. It's quite simple.
Yeah. But an awful lot of this is price parity, isn't it? Because as we know at the moment, the difference between an ICE engine car and a pure EV is still a sizable gap, isn't there? And that's also true in the used market. So, I mean, are we making good progress in getting that price parity down, do you think?
That's a great question. And there are still 2 substantial blockers to EV adoption. The first is price, and the second is infrastructure. And I've shown that, on the price one, there are people definitely prepared to spend more money on doing the right thing and making an environmental choice. Sometimes that can be a practical one and a cost one. But fundamentally, there are a slight lack of wealthy enough people to be able to do that, because to do that, you need to look at this quite simple equation where you are today looking at an EV likely to be around 37% more expensive than an ICE equivalent. That's quite a chunky amount of money for anybody to be paying. And you can see that we're on a trend line which is going in the right direction, though this price gap has been narrowing over past years. If you were to map out the continuous trend line of what we've seen in past years and assume that the same thing can happen in future years, you should be able to assume that by the middle of the decade, you can get to price parity. Now, I do know that with strong RVs, and they started out relatively weak, they're looking a lot stronger and healthier now. There is an opportunity potentially to bridge this gap in terms of the monthly payment, PCP gap, but equally that leasing represents a fantastic opportunity for many people to get into an EV at a cheaper rate. We've seen, for example, that leasing is seeing around 30% of their sales as electric, salary sacrifice as much as nearly 70%. So there are channels where the government taxation incentivization has enabled a really positive equation for individuals, users, and businesses to look into, and has shown that the pricing point really is a substantial one, which will influence sales. But that plug-in car grant, as we know, isn't as high as it ought to be really to bridge the gap today for a retail customer, and that grant isn't going in the right direction. So we've still got some challenges ahead. One of those opportunities, let's say, to bridge the gap and to pick up on that challenge is TCO. And this chart talks to the opportunity to highlight the TCO saving that you can make on an electric vehicle. And we, about 6 months ago, in our first Road to 2030 report, talked about the saving being £100 per 1,000 miles. That £100 become 140 as the price of fuel has got more expensive. Now, unfortunately, this does mean that EVs are getting nearer to ICE by ICE becoming more expensive, if you see what I mean, rather than EVs getting cheaper. It's not quite the right equation. But the £100 has now become 140 as fuel's got more expensive. This particular equation at 140 was done when we saw the price of fuel hitting 155. So as it's continuing to rise, the 140 might become 150 and so on. But there's still a long way to go, even with this TCO calculation. If you can assume that you do, let's say, 10,000 miles, you're making, let's say, you know, £1,500 sort of price saving a year, times, let's say, 3, you're still quite a way off bridging the gap in terms of pricing, which remains, as I said, substantial. Even on an electric used car, you're looking at a substantial sort of typical £8,000 price gap, as this chart shows. We've got 3 types of model here: volume hatchback on the left-hand side, volume SUVs in the middle, premium SUVs on the right, and just taken various models and taken the equivalent median 1-year-old used price of that given model compared to the ICE equivalent. So you can see a substantial journey still for many people to go on to be able to get that TCO equation to stack up for them.
I just wanted to return to an earlier point you made about charging points and in terms of demographics, because this is a big issue, isn't it? Because a lot of the demand that you're seeing is driven by affluent people who are able to easily charge a car at home. We know the charging infrastructure is growing all of the time, but it's still not quite there for a lot of people. But it's not just that point, it's also a mentality point, isn't it? Because we need to get to a point where people are perfectly happy charging their car at a charging point half a mile down the road, or using a charging hub quite, more frequently, as opposed to having the need to charge at home. So it's not just a demographic issue here, and it's not just an infrastructure issue, it's also a mentality issue, isn't it? And that's something which will change over time, but it's probably the hardest point to change, isn't it?
There's definitely a mentality challenge within that, James, and there's a lot of misperceptions, I think, around electric vehicles and what you need to do to charge them, particularly because most of us use these things, and we charge them every night, don't we? I mean, I do, I'm sure you do, and we're used to the fact that we need to do that, and we assume that the same applies to anything electric, our car included. And to take a similar parallel, I don't think any of us, if we're driving an ICE vehicle, would think of the need to pop to a petrol station and fill up with fuel on the way home, ready for the next day, unless we're doing a particularly long journey. And the same would apply with an electric vehicle. If you're going to do a particularly long journey the next day, of course, that's exactly what you'd need to do. That challenge is something we'll need to work through as we hopefully bring to life some of the myth debunking opportunities in terms of what we can do in terms of social media content on our platforms. I mean, Auto Trader, of course, but everybody. I think it's an industry challenge. But what is fantastic is that it is clear to see that the charging station numbers are growing, but it is also clear to see that they are not growing as fast as the pace, as I said, very positive pace of electric vehicle sales. Now, we've seen sales probably triple over the last couple of years, but domestic chargers have increased by around 130 or so %, and public chargers at a lesser rate. So I think the SMMT published some stats that were quite eloquent recently, where they, I think, showed that for every, it used to be that in 2019, I think, there were 11 EVs or plug-ins for every charging station, public charging station. And that went up to 16 in 2020. And likely, given that the rate of increase of public stations is not at the rate of sales of plug-ins, that number is only going to get worse. So we risk, unless something changes, facing sort of queues when we turn up at a charging station rather than available slots. That will hinder, as I mentioned earlier, we need a supply-led model choice journey, and we need a supply-led charging journey. Otherwise, we will hinder sales.
With a greater choice of electric cars appearing on the new market and in turn dripping down into the used market, are you starting to see a change in terms of the cars, the EVs that are most searched for on Auto Trader? I mean, what kinds of trends have you been seeing over the past few years?
It's a great point. We've seen, first of all, an awful lot of change. I think the established order is rapidly being reshuffled. We have, I think all of us, certain reference points, benchmarks. I refer to what I call the decade of confusion that's ahead of us. And by that, I mean the brand reference points we're used to. For example, Ford Fiesta, Ford Focus, Volkswagen Golf, BMW 3 Series. These cars have been around for 40 years. They're in their 7th or 8th generation. They've been fantastic stalwarts of the industry. We all know them. When we go and buy a car, we know what we're looking at. We know our reference points of the terminology, the acronyms. God knows we've got a fair few of those in the car industry. And we've got Uncle whatever who's got some worldly wise ideas to share with us about which car is most relevant. Our friends chatting at the pub or in the office can give us some opinions. That won't happen on electric vehicles for a little while until people have had one themselves, have been able to sort of learn to live with them, can share that experience more widely. And until we change ourselves and live with one, I think it'll still take this decade or so of cycle of change. You know, every 3.5 years we change our car for people to really get used to electric vehicles. And in the meantime, the kind of equation that we're seeing in terms of the changing landscape of the ICE market moving towards an EV market. So when you see on the screen here, lots of pretty colored bubbles. Basically on the left, you've got the size of bubble reflecting the size of audience looking at new product on Auto Trader. You can see dominated by the German premium brands in particular, BMW leading the way, Mercedes, Audi, Volkswagen, etc., looking pretty good. You'll note there Kia in the blue bubble, maybe just below the BMW large one in red. Kia at that point was at 4.4%, I think, of the ICE market of new cars. In the EV market right now, as we're looking today, Kia is the leader, representing nearly 15% and jumping way forward. Hyundai jumping forward as well. MG, you can see growing massively. Fiat doing well. That's a reflection of a real shift in the market. Now we need, as I mentioned before, in this decade of confusion, not just to get used to new acronyms, it's more like kilowatt hours, which is baffling to most people. We've got to absolutely simplify that kind of thing and talk in simpler terms like that people can understand. Like how, if I need to do a quick charge for 30 miles of distance when I'm going out tonight and I've got to do a little journey, how long do I need to charge my car for? Is it 5 minutes, 10 minutes? Not kilowatt hours, percentage of charge of battery. But as things shift, not only that is going to change, but I need to get used to what's an ID3. I knew what a Golf was. What's an e-tron? I knew what an A3 was. What's this Ioniq 5? Has anybody got one? Can anybody tell me about them? That's the decade of confusion that this chart is really referring to. It's all shifting so fast that it's also a reflection of how brands can radically change their perception in the market. So I've mentioned Kia and Hyundai. And I've mentioned already to you the sort of demographic difference of EV buyers to ICE buyers. This chart, a little bit complicated. I'll try and explain it as simply as I can. Basically, it charts the people on our Auto Trader who have got an income of more than £50,000, kind of reference point I used earlier. We've pulled out those 3 standout EV brands that are performing particularly well, Hyundai, Kia, and MG respectively. And what it shows essentially, look at Kia and Hyundai in particular, is that the people who are looking at the Hyundai EV product are 51% in the Hyundai case, 53% in Kia's case, likely to be in the income bracket of more than £50,000. That compares to the high 30s for the people looking at their ICE product. But what these brands have done, and the new entrants coming to the market, Tesla, of course, Polestar, XPeng, BYD, when they come through, they've radically, already these existing brands, changed the perception of their product, the whole range, is shifted with them as they've brought these new exciting EVs to market. And the brand agnostic car buyer in the UK is very open to switching to a Kia or to a Hyundai and comparing them to the prestige models in the market. So this chart highlights the top 10 most popular models on Auto Trader's new car marketplace currently at the start of this year, again based on the share of ad views. You can see it's led by the EV6. This shot to fame, if you like, at the the latter part of 2021, as did the Ioniq 5 that flew equally to the top of the charts. The Mustang is still doing brilliantly. You can see that the chart, though, if you look at the blues, those are the electric vehicles. They're scoring ahead now, not just of, competing against each other. They are beating the ICE equivalents in terms of interest. And 5 out of these top 10 are electric. And if I just show you one last chart, if I may, this is quite an interesting one that shows the evolution of the most popular EV models based again on ad use on our platform. You can see here the 2019 on the left through to 2022 year to date on the right, top 10 as time has moved forwards. The red lines for each car indicate a car that will have dropped out of the top 10s. The blue coming into the market and going and coming into the top 10s. So you can see fundamentally things are shifting so fast. Not only are we getting used to ID3s and e-trons and Ioniqs and EV6s and whole new jargon of make models we didn't know before, but they are rapidly changing, and it's quite hard for brands to, first of all, penetrate in a very noisy market with so many cars being talked about. As you said, all the advertising hitting that space, and then also to sustain that interest is particularly challenging. But it's exciting to see because, as I said earlier, there are an amazing amount of really exciting products in that list.
Yeah, I think the interesting thing about, especially the 2022 year to date, I mean, you've got the likes of BMW, Mercedes there, but you've got MG, you've got Vauxhall, you've got Fiat and Kia, and it's probably a little bit of an overstatement to say this, but it does strike me as though the cases of Brits being snobs is sort of going a little bit, isn't it? Because people are more looking at electric cars in terms of what can that electric car provide for me? Does it fit into my lifestyle? Does it have the tech that I want on board? It's less about the brand on the nose at the moment, isn't it? Whereas, of course, traditionally in the past, you wouldn't have had Kia and Fiat right at, within the top 10 there, would you?
Completely agree with you, James. If the car is a good one, if it's got an exciting level of tech, and they're generally very full of tech, these cars, if it's got the right design appeal and so on, it doesn't matter what the brand is on the front of it. And I think people are finding that actually, if the product is good, then by definition, the brand is becoming attractive. And a brand like Kia or Hyundai are becoming cooler thanks to the coolness of their product, if you like. It is a product and a marketing-led approach. So to give you an example of how that looks, I promise you with no more charts, but I lied. There's another one here. This is an interesting one that shows the number of competitor sets that new ICE models are in compared to new EV models. You've got ICE on the right, EV on the left. And what you can see is that the EV6 is now becoming not quite ubiquitous, but almost. It's in 243 competitor sets. What we mean by this is, if I'm looking at a given car, let's say I'm looking at, in this case, let's say a Mach-E. Am I also looking at anything else? And let's say the EV6 would certainly be in that category. But equally, if I'm looking at a BMW 3 Series, I might well, as the numbers will show here, also be looking at an EV6. What's noticeable in the point you were just making about brands is that I could equally be looking at an Audi, a Mercedes, a Porsche, and also looking at now a Kia EV6 or a Mach-E or an MG and so on. It is becoming, we are brand agnostic, I think, in the UK. We don't think, like, let's say German car buyers are known for sort of preferring Germanic product, either German brands or cars built in Germany. I think the UK buyer buys a product that they like and they think has what's good for them, and they're much less sort of snobbish, as you said. But the EV6, to finish with the example here, fits in there for 243 different competitor sets. That's a huge amount.
Yeah.
If you compare on the right-hand side to some of those ICE products, the Golf, the 3 Series used to be the ubiquitous product that sat equally in sort of 200-300 competitor sets. Everybody looked at a Golf. It's I class this car, it works for everybody. That's no longer the case. It's becoming sort of the product of yesterday, and the product of today is the list on the left-hand side of this chart. Very different.
The final question I just want to make about this slide, and then we'll move on, and we'll just talk a little bit more generally about the new and used car markets. But the thing that I find, one of the most interesting things I find about the slides that you've shown us, and particularly this one, is it wouldn't have been that long ago you would have seen the word Tesla in all of this, wouldn't you? But you haven't mentioned the word Tesla at all during the last, well, 20, at all during this conversation. Is there a reason for that? Is it because the market is now so much broader and people are considering far bigger brands, or is something dramatic really changed?
Tesla is still performing brilliantly, James. Tesla, it often puts new cars on our platform. They essentially have a whole host of cars hitting the market regularly on boats coming from Shanghai and hitting great volumes, the vast majority of which already have customer names against them well before they get near our shore. When they're able to put cars on our marketplace that haven't got names on them as they're on the boat coming over, they do. And they are generally influenced quite regularly by Auto Trader in terms of being then sold, but they're also sold extremely quickly, so quickly that there's not enough time to gather enough quantitative data to really put them in these data sets. We're hoping that will change by the time we produce the next report, but I don't think we can say at all that Tesla are fading from the sort of the views of car buyers in the UK. On the contrary, with the Tesla Model 3, the second best sold car in the UK last year, I think we can expect to see them at the top of these league tables for a good while to come.
Yeah. So Ian, thanks for showing us those slides. Let's just talk a little bit generally about the new and used car markets. I mean, from a used car market perspective, how have you seen the start of the year? Of course, last year was just an incredible year for used cars. Are you seeing that continue into this year as well?
I think the start of the year has been challenging in some ways. It's been harder to predict than probably we expected. I think the very start of the year was quite tricky because January, the first couple of weeks, by all accounts, were quite hard. I think we started off the year with even things like our New Year's landing on a weekend, and the start of the year sales weren't quite therefore as well synchronized with the peak shopping periods we normally hit as they ought to be. The second half of January picked up. First part of February was good. Second part, we saw storms over a couple of weekends, which definitely impacted people's shopping behaviors, sort of general behaviors, website behaviors even, and audience on our platform too. Then factored into that, we've got geopolitical constraints, and we can see things like BBC World Service getting lots of people listening to it in around the world, but we're also looking at BBC websites and listening to their radio or watching their TV programs here in the UK. And that's, seeing a huge spike, leaving us probably less time to do other things. What we're seeing though, overall, is a good return, I think, to health in the last few days. I've heard a lot of retailers tell me that they've hit some record numbers over the last weekend, for example, record ever in many cases. So a lot more positivity out there, but it has been, I think, fair to say, a little bit up and down. I think it's probably a situation of what I'd call robust demand rather than meteoric demand, but with still tight supply out there. I think the retailers are still in a good position to hold very good values and make good returns.
I think there were hopes that the new car supply was going to improve dramatically this year, but it seems like the more manufacturers and more dealers I talk to, it seems like it's not getting easier anytime soon. I mean, are you hearing similar things?
I'm definitely hearing similar things, James, unfortunately. I mean, the sad events in Ukraine are leading to additional supply issues, whether they be sometimes raw material related, even the raw materials used in building chips. And that's the last thing we would have wanted to hear, or raw materials used in batteries of electric vehicles, but also things more sort of mundane parts that we're more used to, perhaps, such as wiring looms or seats, various other items that are produced either in Ukraine or Russia. So they are having a knock-on effect. Certain brands more affected than others. The likes of the Kia and Hyundai sort of success story I touched on a minute ago are much less affected, much more vertically integrated with their suppliers within sometimes their sort of conglomerate type status over there. Similarly with many of the Asian brands, but a lot of the European players I think are more affected. So it does feel like the new car market will be dampened by a lack of supply. But for the moment, in terms of the other issue that we see out there, which is the sort of cost of living crisis that gets talked about a lot by the media, we're not yet seeing any impact in terms of the car buyers' belief in their own affordability of their next car, a question we research every month. And we're not seeing any impact in terms of the propensity to buy a car within a certain time frame, which is another question we ask any visitor to Auto Trader, which again is pretty stable month on month. So overall, I think the situation is more dramatic from a supply point of view than it is from a demand angle.
Would you be surprised if that cost of living didn't have an effect on car purchasing at some point this year?
I think the cost of living crisis is likely to have an impact on some people. My own experience of the financial crisis, running a retailer group back in the late noughties, was that the people downgraded potentially their car, or they drove it a little less. They sometimes serviced it a little less, but they still needed a car. And I think we're still very much in that situation. In the UK, we have the benefit equally of most people taking a car on finance, but most people being in a cycle of needing to renew. So they may renew to a different model, but I think we're unlikely to see a very significant impact. We also, at the moment, automatically drive our cars a little less because we commute a little less often. If we're doing 3 days a week, working in a home maybe, or in the office, whatever it might be, that's probably a couple of days less travel, or at least less significant travel for many people. So that will temper the fuel-related cost increases that people will see. And equally, in terms of the effect on the cost of living more substantially, if people are looking at potentially a several £100, maybe even more increase to their fuel bills at home, and maybe their shopping cart when they're checking out at the supermarket, they are also, if you look at the Bank of England stats, also starting from a strong point of healthy household finances, generally speaking, having retained more money than they spent over the last couple of years. So I don't think it's likely to have a vastly strong impact on the car market now.
Ian, that's all we've got time for today, but some fascinating data there, and really good to have a catch up. So thanks for joining us today.
Thank you, James.
Well, that's it for today's Car Dealer Live. Join us again very soon. Bye-bye.